Well, hello. Hello and welcome all to this upcoming webinar on the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So we are about a minute ahead of schedule, but we wanted to let folks go ahead and come in, get settled. Uh, by default, everyone I think is going to be muted. If you don't already come in muted, one of our teammates will help make sure. We do ask that you stay on mute for the duration of the webinar until we get to the Q&A section at the end, in which case, if you have questions at that point, we'll encourage you to unmute and go ahead and ask your questions live if you choose to do so. This webinar is also being recorded, so just to please be aware of that. If you prefer not to have your image recorded, feel free to turn your camera off the whole time. And the last kind of housekeeping piece as folks are coming in is that we will have the chat running today. So the chat is that little button, it looks like a speech bubble. So if at any point through the webinar, you have questions about what's going on, please feel free to drop those questions into the chat in live time. That way you don't have to keep track of that question till the end. And then when we get to our Q&A section at the end, we'll go through everything that's in the chat at that point. Also, throughout the webinar, during the chat, one of our teammates will be dropping in links to a lot of the resources that we're referencing. So you'll be able to have those as a snapshot. So I know we've still got folks coming in. If you're just joining us, just to let you know, we are recording this webinar, and we do ask that you please stay on mute for the duration of the webinar until we get to the Q&A section at the end. And so with that, we'll go ahead and get started. We've got a lot to cover. So if we haven't met yet in person or virtually, hello, my name is Lauren Pyle. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Outdoor Recreation Grants Manager. And we're here today to talk about the pre-application materials for this upcoming round of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So I'm joined today with our two grant specialists, Marlena Baker and Joe Kill, who are here on the back end. So you might get to interface with them in the chat. So what are we in for today? We're going to be running through each of the required materials for the pre-application phase of this grant round. And so there are 5 of them. That is the pre-application form, the work plan, the budget, the climate resilience risk form, and the permit navigator or project review sheets. And then at the very end of this session, we'll have time for Q&A. So during this whole session, as we're going material to material, we're going to be covering 2 different types of content. First, we're going to be talking about what it is, what kind of information we're asking for, and to give you some tips and tricks as planning them and preparing them. Then we're also going to work you through, as much as we can, some of the basic mechanics of how to navigate the tools. Where can you find them? What are some of the resources? How do you fill that out? So we'll be going through both of those sides. And so to get us started, we're going to go straight into the pre-application form. So this is the first of our materials for the pre-application, and it is a quick, short, fillable PDF form. And we're really asking about 3 different buckets of information. The first, this is going to tell us a bit of information about who is applying for the grant. What is the entity that is applying for the grant? Things like your name, your address, those sorts of things. We also want to know who we should contact with any updates or questions about this proposal. This is the person that we're going to tell if you've been invited to move forward with the full application phase. So that's really all we need, is like, this is the person we're going to notify if you've been invited to move forward, or we're going to provide feedback if you weren't invited to move forward. The next bucket of questions that we're going to be asking about are all about your project at a really, really high level. Things like, give your project a title. Where is it happening? A super, super short description of the project. Is it an acquisition project? Is it a development project? That's sort of general recreation project type. And what types of recreation activities are happening with this project, just to give us some frame of reference. And so this is really just for our staff who will be reviewing these materials to understand your project. This is not the space to really make your case statement for why it's needed, the value, the importance. You'll get to do all that and then some if you're invited to submit for the full application. This is just to help us understand generally what we're looking for. And then the last bucket of questions that we have are really about eligibility, that we're just going to try to scan to make sure that every application that moves forward to that full application phase is truly eligible. We want to save as many people the work as we can if your project isn't eligible for this program. So some of the things that we're asking for are public access, what LWCF calls control and tenure, which is and ownership status, and if there are any indoor structures on the property. So those are sort of the high level pieces that we're asking for. And I'm going over this at a really high level. We also have another resource that I'm going to recommend that you dig into further. It's called the pre-application guidance. We have a lot of these questions broken down in very specific information about each of them. And then as applicable, we often have examples or tips related to them. So if you're looking at a project description going, how on earth can I describe my project in 150 words? We encourage you to go look at the example and just see, it's really just like a high level couple of sentences. What are you doing? Just so that we have that frame of reference. So I encourage you to check it out for more information. With this pre-application form, these are the types of things that we're asking, but as I said, it's a fillable PDF. And just to give you a little snapshot of what this looks like, this is one of the pages in the form. And as you can see, there's sort of these grayed out boxes. Those are the places where you enter data. And so some of them, you really just click the box and it will say yes or no. And it will check it for you. Other times there might be those more open-ended responses. And so it's a pretty short and simple form to just tell us that high-level information. Where we start to get the details is in the next pre-application material that you'll need to submit, and that is the work plan. Your work plan is really that space for you to tell us all of the details about your project. What are you doing? Who's going to do it? What will it accomplish? And when will that happen? And throughout this work planning piece, we recommend that you separate really that work into different phases as much as it makes sense. And one of the pieces that's been commonly used in the past is if you have different activities that say require different groups of people or different types of materials and equipment or have different timelines, those are good to pull out. Within that. So if like you have a type of work that's being done by a contractor, they're doing the major playground installation and resurfacing, but you're going to have volunteers who are doing landscaping. Separate those two activities because they're both different scopes of work and they're being done by different groups of people. So it's really easy to separate them out and probably at different times. And the big thing what we recommend is that as you're doing this, don't name contractors. Don't say ABC company is doing the installation. Instead, use more generic terms like the professional contractor, the trail builder, the planning and permitting specialist. You can use those more generic terms rather than specific firm names or specific individual names. And that's because for our grant requirements at the end, if you're selected to move forward with the grant, you're going to have to go through a procurement process with bidding. So even if you've been working with a group or a contractor to help develop your plan through this time, you can't guarantee at this point that that's who's going to do the work. So instead, hold space for those more general pieces. And if this is new to you in terms of the procurement requirements, we actually have a resource that I'm going to recommend that you check out. It is a procurement resource specifically for grantees, but as an applicant, it might be good to know of like, what are you going to be expected to do long-term once your project is ready to go out for bid? What are the pieces you need to do to meet the state requirements? So that's probably going to be coming to you in the chat shortly. So that can be a tip, but just in your work plan, don't name the companies. And so just a few more examples of how you might be able to separate things out is thinking about the phases of the project, what is happening at different times. And some common buckets of activities are, if you have final surveying, design, and engineering work, final permitting work, that bids, quotes, final budgeting work, those different construction components or potentially construction phases. And then if there are any site visits, events, or anything like that, just make sure you're separating each of those out within your work plan. And as you're thinking about this timeline for your work plan, it's really got to fit within the overall LWCF timeline for this grant round. So we're currently there in the pre-application phase. We're accepting pre-applications through December 13th. And then we're going to turn around pretty quickly to let everybody know if they've been selected to move forward to the full application phase. And that'll be due March 15th. From mid-March to May, we're going to be reviewing applications as fast as we can with our ranking committee, who will ultimately be making the final recommendations about the projects that we're going to move forward with. And then from there, this is different from many other grants that FPR offers, because next summer, for the grants that are selected to move forward, we move into the compliance review phase. This is when things like final permitting, NEPA, Section 106, all of these final pieces will need to be complete. And we're only going to ask for that for projects that we're moving forward with. Because for many circumstances, it depends if you're an acquisition or development project. Sometimes those are eligible for pre-award costs, but they have to be done before we can get to the next step, which is submitting the projects to the National Park Service for their review. And we expect, that's going to happen. We're going to submit them to the Park Service basically as soon as they're ready. So some projects might have more compliance steps than others. But as soon as the National Park Service gives their approval for the projects, that's when we're going to go into our grant agreement development phase, which we're expecting to basically take place from February to March 2026. So we're already looking at over a year from now, about a year and a half coming in for those last ones. And so the time for your work plan to think about when you can do the construction work, if you're doing a construction project, is from June 1st, 2026 through December 31st, 2028. So you can do planning and permitting, as we said before then, for development projects, but any construction work has to wait. For the acquisition projects, if you're going to be purchasing land, again, you can do a lot of that pre-work beforehand, but it's not actually eligible for reimbursement generally. So we have those kind of pieces with the acquisition that generally National Park Service recommends that you wait to do the acquisition unless there's an emergency. And I think we're going to get into that in just another minute. And so using the work plan template, we have provided a Microsoft Word version of the template. You also should be able to open this template within Google Docs or other word processing software. If you're having technical problems opening and accessing the document, please let us know. We'll do our best to try to get it into a format that you can type in or that you can write in if that's the case. And so when you're building your work plan, we recommend that you break it into steps using bullets and make sure you're trying to put those steps as much as you can in timeline order of when they're starting and stopping. And try to be as clear and concise as possible for someone who's not intimately involved in the project, someone who doesn't have your same level of expertise maybe to understand what's going on. So the analogy I often like to make, if anybody out there has ever watched or ever heard of the Great British Baking Show, they have a component called the technical challenge, right? And the whole part of it is that there's usually these really slimmed down directions, and it's up to the contestants within that show to actually try to figure out and apply their knowledge. It's a test of their expertise. Please do not test us as reviewers. Please, you have the expertise, and so we ask that you just provide those additional directions so that your work plan doesn't read like a Great British Baking Show technical challenge, so that we don't have to try to guess what the steps are or infer what's not there. So just making sure it's clear for someone who's not involved in the day-to-day. And we do ask, recognizing that sometimes these projects that are being submitted to the Land and Water Conservation Fund are part of a broader initiative, right? Like you might submit to the Land and Water Conservation Fund for bathrooms and parking lot and maybe another like park shelter picnic area that's in one piece of this park, but maybe you have other phases of work planned that you want ultimately the ranking committee to hear about, because you want to show the value of this investment, that it's part of a bigger picture. Within the work plan, we just ask that you separate what you want from LWCF that you're going to do with that work from those other components. And so those other components could be other phases of work. They also could be work that is normally not eligible for LWCF, right? You might say, we're going to host this huge like marketing campaign, right? Marketing is fantastic. It's not eligible for LWCF, but you still want the ranking committee to ultimately be aware of that. So just separate those out in the work plan if it applies. If your project is 100% going to be related to that LWCF project, you don't have to put anything in the bottom section. It's just there to help us tease it out, because sometimes it's hard to tell when it's all lumped together of what's actually in this grant versus what's part of a bigger vision. And here's an example of the work plan template filled out. This is in the very back as well, of like, what are we looking for the level of detail? What types of information are we looking for in each column? So if you like to use examples as models, we encourage you to look at this further, but know that it's there for you. And I'm getting ahead of myself, of these columns, right? So the first pieces there within this work plan are the park, where's the park? What's the location name? The first column on the left is that high level activity description. And then you're going to get into the details of what's actually happening as part of it. What are the sub-steps that feed into that? Then we have a section for what we call anticipated results. Those quantifiable list of what you'll accomplish. And then the anticipated start and end dates. We want to focus on the anticipated results because that's a question we've often gotten in the past of like, what are those? How do I get those? And that's really our goal, is to say, like, if you were going to put a finite piece to say, like, this is what success looks like, this is the number, this is how we're going to measure this. That's really what we're talking about. And so it could be a hard number to say, we're going to make a parking lot that has 12 parking spaces in it. Great. If you know 12, fabulous. If you're in doubt, you could say, we're going to have a parking lot and it's going to have 8 to 15 spaces in it. Yeah, give it a range. Or it's going to have at least 10 or up to 15. You can give those ranges and use those qualifiers, but try to put a number on it if it makes sense for what it is. And it's also okay, depending on how you do your work plan, to not have a result for every single activity. When people are developing work plans, we've known this in the past, some people are lumpers and some people are splitters when it comes to the level of detail, right? Some people want to put everything in one line, and some people want each thing to be on its own line. Whichever strategy you prefer, as long as it's clear to us what we're seeing works for us. But we want to see those anticipated results at any major activity where it could be that finished deliverable. And just some examples to go over those. This could be like miles of new trail, number of new accessible facilities. If you're doing a land acquisition, the acres of land to be acquired, number of new fields, something as simple as number of culverts, number of parking spaces, the square footage of the playground or the facility that's going to be worked on, the number of signs. So if you can say this is going to be the result, that's what we're trying to capture in a snapshot there. So that's the work plan. The other major document that's going to tell us a lot about your project for the pre-application review is the budget. And as you're planning your budget, we recommend that you're thorough, detailed, and accurate, and really make sure your budget fully encapsulates the anticipated costs for your project. And there are different eligible and ineligible costs for acquisition and development projects. And so we encourage you to go and refer to that pre-application guidance based on your project type to confirm those project eligibility and cost eligibility. The other piece we like to remind folks for budget planning is that LWCF is a reimbursement grant, and you can request reimbursement as frequently as quarterly. So every 3 months. It's not like a designated 3-month period, but as frequently as every 3 months. And for us, with that reimbursement request, we always like to highlight this when people are thinking about their budgets, because we've gotten questions for other grants in the past of, well, how much money can I go for? And part of the question that we turn around and ask is, well, how much can you afford? Because you have to be able to cover those costs and front that expenses for at least that 3-month period. And then it takes another generally 4 to 6 weeks to be reimbursed once your reimbursement process is submitted. And so just to know that in terms of planning, to say, oh, well, yes, we have the cash, we're going to do this. This is our plan. This is our dream. This is our vision. We're great here. Or maybe we need a loan or some other type of, we're going to dip into reserves. We've got this plan. And so we want to share that now as you're thinking about your budget of just how big to go, because it is a constraint that we recognize, particularly for a lot of smaller municipalities, that everyone is working within. It's just depending on that cash flow piece. And so as you're building your budget, LWCF requires a 50-50 match. So for every dollar you request from LWCF, you have to be able to contribute another dollar on the expenses. And so that match can be cash or it can be in kind. And so when we say cash, that's things like if you have other state funds, like local cash contributions, like say a budget allocation or a bond. You have private contributions or grants from private foundations, donations from individuals, all count as that cash piece. But your in kind can be materials. It can be labor. It can be use of equipment. If your town, say, already owns heavy construction equipment that's going to be used in this project, you can count those in-kind contributions as well. The biggest piece where it becomes really a lot more nuance in terms of budget planning for LWCF is around federal dollars. Because per the federal requirements for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, there are 2 federal grants that are allowed to be used as sources of funding for LWCF match. They are the Recreational Trails Program, or RTP, and the Community Development Block Grants. No other sources of funds that are federal funds, whether currently or originally, are allowed to be used as match for LWCF. So unfortunately, it means things like ARPA dollars, FEMA dollars, other grants. You cannot use those types of funds as your cash match for LWCF. So you've got it there. You also cannot use ineligible costs as match. And there is some kind of trickiness when it comes to pre-award costs. I told you we were going to come back to this. So those pre-award costs work. So for acquisitions, right, your land purchases, if that's the type of work you're doing, generally they want you to wait to do the acquisition until after National Park Service approval. But there may be circumstances where you actually need to purchase that land faster. Say you're going to lose it if that's going to happen. It is possible to get reimbursed for that if the purchase was already made beforehand, but there's an additional step of paperwork. It's called the waiver of retroactivity. And so if you're selected to move forward and your acquisition has already closed, or it will close before the National Park Service is able to approve it if you're selected, then at that point we can go through that process to see if the National Park Service will approve it. But until National Park Service approves that waiver of retroactivity, nothing is guaranteed. And even in general, within our LWCF, I want to remind folks that this is a competitive application period. So if you are moving forward with work in advance, there's no guarantee that your LWCF project will be selected. So just to know that going into it. In terms of other pre-award costs for acquisitions, they don't allow what they call incidental pre-award purchase, really any incidental costs for an acquisition purchase to be counted, even if they happen pre-award. And incidental costs, unfortunately for them, include all the things that they actually require for an acquisition to be approved. So things like appraisal fees, title searches, those types of pre-work before an acquisition, they don't allow those to be counted, even if it was done pre-award. It needs to be done. You just can't ask it as match or as a request. For the development projects, you are allowed to count within your budget pre-award planning and permitting costs only that are going to be incurred within 3 years of the National Park Service submission. And even then, those are only allowed to be counted if they're in your budget. So as you're putting together your match calculations, if you are doing a development project and you want to count, design work that's happened this year or permitting work that's going to be happening next summer before the National Park Service will get to look at it, make sure that's in your budget now. Because if it's not in your budget, when we go to submit it to the National Park Service, they won't be able to fund it. They won't be able to do it, but they will do that sort of retroactive reimbursement of those pre-award costs for those types of activities. That being said, the one thing they will not reimburse or count as match for pre-award development costs are anything related to construction. So if you're like, okay, well, we're going to plan to do site prep this summer because we've already done our permitting, we've already done all the historical review, we've done NEPA, we've done all our clearances. Next is going to be the site prep, and we want to do that next summer. Well, if you do site prep next summer, it's not going to count for your LWCF grant. You have to wait until National Park Service does the approval to be able to count any of those expenses towards your cost, anything that's related to construction. And so with that match, as I said, it's a dollar for dollar match. It's 50% of your total project costs. And even then, it's 50% of your total allowable project costs. So within the budget template, you're allowed to put both the allowed costs, but you are also, there's a whole column to share costs that are not allowed for participation. Those are basically your ineligible costs that you want to report as part of your budget. So there's a whole column for that to be able to share it out. That 50% rule, though, also applies only to the total number, not to any individual line items, and not to any individual categories. So you might have some categories of work where you're asking for 100% LWCF funds, but then another category that you're doing exclusively through your covered costs. And that's okay. You're allowed to split it out that way. It just has to fit towards the total. But please be aware that when you go to submit those reimbursements down the road, for every reimbursement, you're going to have to submit a 50-50 request, like at equal dollars of match as it is to expenses. So just as you're planning it out, make sure you're not saying, well, we're going to use all the LWCF funds in your mind. You cannot use all your LWCF funds for the first, $100,000 of your $200,000 budget, and we'll figure out the rest later. You cannot do that. It has to be 50-50 at each reimbursement along the way. You are also allowed to have more match than is required. You can have, say you're only asking for LWCF funds for 250 of a 1,000 of a $1 million project. You're allowed to do that. But just know that if you do, you're going to be held accountable to whatever your final match percentage is. So just to be mindful, if you go more than 50-50, say you want to cover 75% of the cost, that you will be held accountable in the end to that 75%. And that'll apply to the reimbursements and all those pieces too. And so how to record this on the budget template in terms of your match is that we actually don't care at this phase in the budget development of where the money is coming from. We don't care really like, oh, well, this is coming from a grant, this is coming from reserves, this is coming from budget. That part doesn't matter. We're not talking about the income. We're only talking about the expenses that are there. And there's not really a need to separate out your LWCF expenses from your match expenses at this point. But for your full application, you should be aware that you will have a space where you're going to be required to talk about what are the sources and what are the status of that match. And that'll be the full application. Again, that's by March. So that's when you need to have your firm plan in place. But for the pre-application budget, you just need the expenses. Another question that we've been commonly getting about LWCF match is like, when do you have to have those dollars in hand? And the question or the answer is that you need to have a plan for those dollars by the full application. But really the ultimate deadline of when you have that match commitment confirmed is at each reimbursement. You don't have to have all of your matching funds by the application date, by the National Park Service date. Like, you just need them whenever you're asking for money, because we're going to uphold that percentage at each reimbursement request. So just to know that for your mental planning, it doesn't have to be all the match right up front confirmed now, but you should have a pretty strong plan, again, by that full application deadline, of how you're going to secure that match, particularly if it's a larger project, to be able to say. The last kind of financial piece that I want to touch on with this is really about the documentation requirements, because as you're building your budget now, what you're going to have to report on might influence some of your numbers, because LWCF does allow for project administration. And if you're trying to figure out like, well, how much time is that going to take? Some of it is that documentation required, right? And so know that for any of your expenses, you're going to have to submit documentation. So things like invoices, labor report forms, receipts, timesheets, volunteer sign-ins, both for your expenses and your match. You're going to have to do that. And if there was a donation, we need it to be a signed donation form, and really to have that clear documentation and flow. So just know that that's a piece as you're thinking about what does What does project administration for this grant look like? Is that you're going to have to pull all those pieces together for every reimbursement. Another kind of fine print piece that we go to with the budget is around equipment. So there is a section in the budget for equipment. And the way the state defines equipment is that it is any item that is an individual item that is valued at over $5,000 that is going to be purchased for the purposes of this grant. And so if your equipment is going to be permanently installed at your facility, say it's the playground equipment for the playground, there's generally not any questions or trouble with that, because once you buy that playground equipment, right, it's getting installed and it will forever be used for the purposes of this grant project. Where it gets trickier is that if you were trying to think about buying other equipment, and LWCF does not fund maintenance equipment, so it does not fund mowers, it does not fund trucks, it does not fund most other things that are that, but know that any equipment, any of those single items that are valued at over $5,000 per item, it has to be retained by the grantee and only used for work on this project forever, basically until the end of the useful life of that item, even after the end date of this project. So this is not the time to try to submit to say, oh, we're going to get this, and then after the end of the grant period, we're going to use it for other things, we're going to sell it. That's not how it works. You need to, once you've purchased it, you need to retain it and continue to use it for the life of that item. And it varies item by item of, well, what is the useful life? And I want to be clear that this is a per item cost, not a like item total cost, right? If you buy more than $5,000 of mulch, right, it has to go on the project. That's what it has to be for. But useful life of mulch is pretty short, right? But say it's trees, right? You're using the trees for your landscaping and all these plantings. Even if your landscaping total is more than $5,000, that's not tripping the equipment stipulations the same way that it would be if a single item is over $5,000. And then with these financial documentation, the other piece to sort of start thinking through now are staff versus contractor requirements. Because you'll see in the form, LWCF does fund both salary and fringe for staff. And it'll also fund contracted costs. But really the documentation pieces are different. So for a contractor, all we're going to require is that you get competitive bids for that project. And then whatever the final invoice the contractor gives you, that's what you'll submit as a proof of your documentation. However, for staff, if you're using staff for project administration, for doing the implementation, the construction of the project, you will need both a labor report, so an itemized description of basically what that person has been doing, and then a timesheet, a log of the hours that they have spent on that project. And so the administrative burden on those is just a little bit different, which is why we want to call them out during this budget planning time, because it's just different financial documentation. So within the budget template, this is set up as a Microsoft Excel format. Again, it should be able to be opened in Google Sheets. If you have any challenges using it based on your software access, please let us know. We'll be in touch. But with this form, some recommendations of do make sure 100% of your costs are covered, because if it's not in your budget, we can't fund it. Do include short descriptions for each line that describe what it is and how you landed on that number. To say I need $100,000 for gravel might not make you blink an eye, but it might make the review committee blink, unless they know, okay, well, they got this number because it's this many dollars per ton. They need this many tons plus delivery, and that's how they got to that number. That validation really helps all grantees, because it prevents a lot of the questions that often come up during the further review of like, where did this number come from? So share that math. And we do recommend that you get multiple estimates, as it makes sense to build your budget. For example, if you have a project and you're getting trying to think of what a good example is. So if you're trying to get, like, say, a parking lot improved, and you're going to be doing a new parking lot, putting in a new parking lot, and it's a new gravel lot, and you've got these pieces, and you've got one contractor that says it'll be $15,000, and two other contractors tell you no, it will be $30,000 to $40,000. Within your budget, we recommend you get that multiple estimates so that you have that multiple numbers, and don't necessarily base your budget on the lowest number. Because what happens if that lowest number person comes back and says, actually, there's all these other costs? Or what if that lowest number person decides that, they did do really economical work, but they're done with the cold and the snow and they're moving to Arizona, or they retire, or any other measure of things that could happen. They get booked out when you'd want to need them. So make sure within your budget, you're building your budget for that general estimate of what it could be, even if it's on the higher range. You'll get to pick your contractors later, but you want to make sure that you have enough money within your budget to actually accomplish the work. And within the budget template, there's actually a whole section called the budget category guidance tab. If you're trying to figure out, like, does it go into architecture and engineering or other engineering costs, right? Like, those are actually two different line items. There's some pretty clear instructions on that budget guidance tab of what it should be. And no, we didn't just pick these categories because we feel like making things complicated. These are actually categories that will ultimately link to federal forms that we'll need to submit to the National Park Service, which is why we've gone with them to begin with. So it just makes it easier from start to end. And so review that category guidance if you're trying to figure out, where does this specific cost go? We, just like the budget, we ask that you do not name a contractor as the line item. You can use more generic terms like contracted labor, contracted surveyor, or even contracted surveyor based on quote from such and such company. You can reference, like, that's your math, is it's based on quotes. So you can reference that, but don't say that the line item is ABC surveying. That's not what it is, or ABC surveying company. Like, we want to see more generic descriptions within the budget. We also don't want you to lump numbers together. I know sometimes when you get estimates from other groups, they might say, well, this is materials and this is labor and this is equipment. You can actually tease that out, but other contractors should be like, this is the cost. We do actually need the split out based on the categories we have provided in the budget. And again, this is because this is what the National Park Service is ultimately going to need to have in order to consider your project. We also recommend that you don't change the formulas within the budget. And that's because we've tallied them up so that they add. And so you can add extra lines in them, but if you change the formulas too much, it might throw off your math and you might not be able to actually get as much money as you might need. We've had that happen where, like, somehow a $20,000 line just didn't get put into the totals. So just watch for that as you go forward. And within those budget categories, I know I've mentioned them a couple times. Some of the common ones that people will use are the administration and legal category. If you're doing land acquisition, there's a category for those purchases to secure the new parcels. Architectural and engineering fees, project inspection fees, site work, demolition and removal, construction, and equipment. There is also a line item within the budget template for contingencies. And per the National Park Service's requirements, you are allowed to budget for contingencies as terms of a budgeting account that's basically an inflationary line, but you cannot request reimbursement ever for contingency reserves. So just know on those reimbursement requests, like, you can't reimburse for contingency reserve. You only can reimburse for expenses. And per the National Park Service's requirements, you can have a contingency of generally 10 to 15%. They say that that's a completely allowable number. But if you're requesting any more than that, based on whatever reasoning, just know that you're going to need to justify that first to the ranking committee and then to the National Park Service. So if you have a solid line of logic to say, this is why we're budgeting for this additional pieces, this contingency, like, make sure you have that case statement really well prepared. Because it really is mostly an inflation line in many ways. It amounts for things that are bigger changes that are often included in construction contingency funds are generally not allowed for LWCF. So things like contingencies for major scope changes, unforeseen risks, or extraordinary events, those are actually not allowed within the contingency line for LWCF. And that is, again, the federal requirement that's there. If you don't want to use the contingency line, you can also, we've given folks permission to say you can also account for inflation in the individual budget lines. If you're like, yeah, well, I got a quote for $20,000 for labor, I'm going to add 10% on it. So my budget line is $22,000 for labor. That's just what, like, but you can just put that in your description. It's like based on the quote plus 10% for inflation. You can do it line item by line item, or you can do it for that whole proportion of your construction costs at the bottom. And there are a few other categories that are on that budget form because they might be eligible for LWCF, but then again, they might not. So LWCF does have some pretty strict requirements around relocation expenses, miscellaneous expenses, as they call them, as well as project income. And generally, like during the duration of the project, we don't tend to see project income. Like, say, if you're doing a swimming pool and you're charging an admission fee for the swimming pool, generally you're not collecting those fees during the construction or significant renovation of that project. Those happen afterwards. And so we're only talking about project income that's happening during the project period. But if you have one of those less common circumstances as related to budget, please just check with our team first. And similar to the work plan template, there is a copy of the budget at the end of the pre-application guidance that is already filled out as a sample, so you can see the types of information that we're expecting for each of the columns and the level of detail. As you can see, it's pretty short. It's mostly about those numbers. So the fourth piece of the pre-application form is, again, a fillable PDF, and this is the Climate Resilience Risk Form. This is a brand new form that we're piloting this year. And we're piloting it because we have prioritized within our statewide plans, comprehensive plans for outdoor recreation, that resilience is really important. Particularly the flooding events of the last 2 summers have made us realize that projects that were designed with resilience in mind actually have fared better overall than, say, our older infrastructure that didn't quite have that as a major focus when it was initially put in. And so this climate resilience risk form is just an opportunity to go through those different pieces and identify and codify potential climate impact risks for each location. And so what this form covers, it's going to ask a series of questions up at the top about the project context. Like, where is your project in relation to the area around it? What's uphill? What's downhill? What's nearby in terms of the topographic and geographic features? It also asks about the general design for your project. You know, what type of materials are you using? What strategies are you using to mitigate and prevent erosion? How steep is it in terms of where your design is? Where's the water in relation to your project? Particularly over the last few years, it seems to be that flooding and significant rain events tend to be where Vermont is feeling the greatest climate impacts lately as it relates to recreation. And so these series of questions are all asking about your proximity to rivers, streams, and wetlands. But there are other ecological considerations too, things like endangered species, potential impacts on invasive species, or endangered species, excuse me, that we want to ask about and assess. Because within recreation in particular, say like with invasive species, if you know there's an invasive species that's going to be where you're going to be, say, putting in your parking lot or putting in your restrooms, it's really a best strategy to mitigate that invasive species first, so that the users to your facility don't accidentally transmit that species to somewhere else. So this is an opportunity just to flag and do kind of a survey of what's there. And then the final set of questions within this form are all about visitor management, because we know that not every recreation resource has to or should be open all the time. And so we're just asking you what your plans are for this. And we addressed this a bit in the first webinar, but just to reiterate again, is that this is an opportunity just to do some assessment. It's not going to actually impact at this point whether or not your project is selected to move forward. But what we're going to be doing through the pre-application phase is reviewing this information to say, like, is it complete? Is it filled out? And then to call out some certain pieces and look for them and to help you highlight those as in your full application. For example, if your project is using water bars to help move water off of your pathway, off of your trail, something like that, water bars need maintenance in order to continue to be successful. And so we might call it, say, hey, we notice your project has water bars based on the form. please make sure that your final narrative addresses your plan to clean those out, to maintain them. And that will help you build a stronger stewardship plan that'll make a better and hopefully a higher ranking proposal for the full app. So it's going to give us the opportunity to highlight things that you can call out to strengthen your final proposal. And so some tips for this form as you're completing it is know that it's new. And so we have a whole separate guidance just on this form. It does use some kind of technical terms. So if you're not familiar with, say, what outsloping is, it is a trail related term. But if you don't know what it is, it's okay. We have a guidance that explains it. And once, hopefully, if that works for you, you read through it, you'll be like, oh, actually, I can tell you whether or not I have this, whether or not this is a part of my project. But we have those terms all defined of like, what does this mean within that guidance? We also recommend in general that this form is completed by the project manager or someone else with technical expertise as relates to your project. Knowing that sometimes grant applications are submitted by volunteer committees, they might be submitted by recreation staff who are maybe more on the programming side. That's what I used to do. Like I was more on the programming end, but it's helpful for this form if you do have someone with a bit of that construction and technical content knowledge to help you fill that out. But it is a pretty short form overall that you just click those bubbles, but it just helps. It also helps if you don't just try to remember your project, but you go out and do this form on site. It can be really helpful to do that, particularly if you have the opportunity to do that after a rain. We know that between now and the deadline on December 13th, it might not rain sufficiently enough to be able to actually be able to assess this. So know that that's okay, but just keep your mind out is that it is good to go and actually do a field assessment. But there are other tools that might be helpful inside too. So you might need to use a little bit of a mixed strategy to put this together. You might need to go look at maps or go look at Google Earth or ANR Atlas to be able to fully say, oh, is there something there? I'm not exactly sure. We also recommend that you do your best to answer all the questions on this form. For some of the response options, we've answered unknown or NA. A lot of the pieces, because FPR funds a lot of trail work, many of the questions are like trail construction specific. So if it's not applicable to your project, just say not applicable. But if it is unknown, we really recommend that you only answer unknown if you can't get that information. Now, do your best to get them all. If you're writing in unknown when it wasn't offered as an option, we're probably going to have questions, right? Like, what is the surface going to be in your project? If you say unknown, like you don't know if you're going to do gravel or pavement or like a mixed media, like you don't know what that is, chances are you're not ready for LWCF. But if you're like, oh yeah, I know what it's going to be, that's okay to just fill out as much as you can. And because this is both the first year of the form and many of the projects that FPR funds, we've been trying to do one form for all of the projects. Many of the projects we fund are related to trails or like large scale parks that way. If there are things that come up and you're like, this just isn't working for me, I don't understand, how should I do this? Please reach out to us with questions. We want to make sure that people have the guidance that if something isn't working in the form, please let us know as soon as possible, but we're happy to provide advice as much as we can. And so just to give you a preview of what this form looks like, it is very similar to that original pre-application form. It's the PDF. Again, those sort of grayed out boxes are where you write information, and the rest of it is just check the boxes. So the final piece that we will need for development projects only are the permit results. We're going to be actually updating the guidances and information online because we had said, oh, everybody needs permit results. And then somebody asked us a really great question of like, but I'm buying land. Do I actually need to do permits for this? You're like, that is a great point. We don't actually need a permit report for this. But if you're doing construction in any way, shape, or form, if it's a development project, even if it's a combination acquisition and development project, we're going to need to have your permit navigator report or project review sheet, depending on your project. And this is required even if you own the land and even if you're only working within an existing footprint. You're tearing down the old dilapidated picnic shelter and replacing it with a new one. Even if you're within that existing footprint, you still need to do this permit reporting. And we have extensive directions about how to do each of these things in the pre-application guidance document. And really, there are two versions of it. Which version you do all depends on the type of the project you are, because both the Permit Navigator report and the project review sheet at the end of the day provide you with a list of potential permits you might need and the contact information of the DEC specialists to reach out to confirm whether or not you might actually need that permit. And so the Permit Navigator is an online tool. It can be done at any time and it's great for single point projects or like single parcel projects. If you happen to have a very large scale project that's taking place at multiple sites, or it's like this huge, long, trail greenway that you're putting in, or this, really significant linear connector system, that is something that generally DEC recommends that you use the project review sheet for, just because the Permit Navigator tool isn't configured for those more complex projects. And it does need a human to review it. So if you haven't started that yet and your project is that very large scale complex one, please start that as soon as possible, because DEC recommends reaching that or doing that and starting that process 1 month before the deadline, which is basically now. So if that is you and your project, you're going to need this for that development side, please be sure to pursue that as soon as possible. So just a little bit more on permitting is that remember that these permit reports are not actually permits themselves. They're just the list of what permits you might need. And so we always recommend that folks follow up with those DEC permit specialists as the next step. You also will need to check for municipal permits. If you know anything about federal reviews for the historical review, that's not a part of this report. And then if you do need permits, know that it's generally a 3 to 6 month process. And we recommend and call this out because I mean, literally today I was talking with a grantee who we currently have funded, who's partway through a project and is having to change their entire project based on permitting requirements. They realized that in order to move forward with their original plan, it was going to be almost $10,000 of permitting expenses plus all this other work. So they're actually redesigning their project to be able to do that. And that's really hard to be able to pull that together. And so we recommend you start this process now so that you account for permitting both in your work plan and your budget. Because we don't want you to get surprised by permitting costs later. This is one where they're like, we didn't know it was going to be $10,000. So don't get surprised later. Like, put in your budgets now. And remember, if it's not in your budget, LWCF can't help you cover it for those development projects. And we do recommend, like, permitting is an extensive process. So just plan for all of next summer: permitting, final planning, compliance pieces, and then construction will need to wait until after the National Park Service authorization, which will be starting in that 2026 filled season, running through the 2028 filled season. And so what next? If you do not already have a UEI, a unique entity identifier, this is something you're going to have for the full application. You can go to sam.gov and get one now. You don't need to have an active registration at sam.gov because that's a different, more complex process than it used to be, but you have to have a UEI assigned. So please do that if you haven't done it already. Most towns already do. But just in case, or, it got done before you have to find it, track it down. It's good to start that process now because it can be an extended timeline. The other piece that we recommend is that you review the sample grant agreement that's posted online. So when we develop a grant agreement, it is customized to every individual project that we're working with. It talks about the scope of work, the timeline, all of those pieces. But there are some general provisions that are consistent across all grants, right? Like there's something called Attachment C, and that is standard state provisions across every grant in the state, not just ours. And so that is a requirement that you're going to have to uphold. There are different pieces of fine print as related to federal requirements. And so we encourage you to look at that sample grant agreement now to understand what you might be committing to, and also to build that into your work plan and budget, right? If you're going to need more project administration time or something else is going to change your timeline. We also strongly encourage you to check out that pre-application guidance document that I've been referencing this whole time. And just to give some highlights to it, there are a couple pieces in there that I want to pull out. And the first is that we've embedded examples throughout the whole document. And these are generally in boxes with this kind of orangish background. And these are examples when we say, we're talking about a grant title. What should my title look like? Here are some examples, right? That's the screenshot I took for you there. We also have grade background boxes that are either tips or really important key information. So just watch out for those gray boxes throughout there. And again, we have those work plan and budget examples at the end. This is not going to be the only time that we're able to provide support. The first 2 sessions that we have been doing are really webinars where we talk at you for most of the time. I know we're coming up to the top of the hour. I'm going to be happy to stay on and continue answering questions after this. So if you've got to hop off, well, understand. But we have 2 more opportunities scheduled for you to hop on live and ask us questions, because generally we don't have capacity to meet one-to-one with everyone. So we got one coming up on Thursday, November 19th at 1 p.m. And then a second one the week of the deadline coming up on December 10th at 10 a.m. And you can register online for those on our website. We're also always available by email. Please contact us at anr.fprrecreationgrants@vermont.gov with your questions. So myself, Marlena, Joe, we all answer that inbox. And so generally that's your best place to go if you have time-sensitive questions. So one of us will get back to you as quick as we can. Because we're coming to the end here. And just as that final reminder that our pre-applications are due December 13th. So all the pieces that we talked about are due December 13th. And so with this, I know I've been seeing the chat bubble up. We'll go ahead. I'll stop my share here and open it up now for questions and answer.
Yes, so Nick has a question. For the work plan, when can we start the RFP process?
Yeah, so for the RFP itself, it's for the construction. It depends on what you're talking about, Nick. So because it depends on what part of the RFP are you talking about. If you're talking about an RFP for construction, I really recommend you're going to need to wait until after that National Park Service authorization has come through, just to be sure that there aren't some additional requirements that you need to include in your contracts for that construction work, right? Like there might be some extra provisions that you need to put into those that'll be clearly spelled out in your grant agreement. So you've got to wait for that. If it's things like we need an RFP because we need to have a wetlands delineation done as part of that planning and permitting phase, you can go ahead and do that now for as I said, that's for that development type of project. So it just depends on the scope of work, whether it falls in that construction phase or that planning and permitting phase.
And then he did have another question about if ARPA funds are eligible for a match, but Joe did respond. And if you want to just remind folks about what funds are eligible, that'd be great, Lauren.
Yeah, thanks, Marlena, and Joe for answering that one. So ARPA funds are unfortunately not eligible for match as this. With LWCF, the only federal dollars that are eligible are the Recreational Trails Program, or RTP, and Community Development Block Grants. Any other grant, like federal funding that even originated with other federal entities, including like say Northern Borders Commission grants. I know they have some federal grants that they subgrant out. If it started as federal dollars, you're not allowed to use it as match, except for RTP and those community development block grants. But you are allowed all the state funds you'd like, all that you have access to, all your local municipal funds, private funds, and then in-kind donations of labor, materials, and equipment. So all of those pieces. I'm seeing a hand from Shelly. Maybe we'll hop to that one next. So go ahead, Shelly.
Hey guys, appreciate this. So question on the climate resilience risk form, and I will look at the documentation knowing that this is new, but if we have 2 intermittent streams that we know are intermittent, you go to question 3, it says, would that still be considered seeps in wet areas? Would you check that off even though we know we have intermittent streams? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, I think on question 3, that'll be one, because there actually might even be a question farther down. I don't have the form right up in front of me that asks specifically about intermittent streams in that water section.
Yeah, on the back side it does.
Yeah, I would say I think it's there. So I think you can just say like intermittent streams are the intermittent streams question. But if you know it's there, like please feel free to put that in. Yeah, that's a great piece to include.
And then going to the intermittent streams is on question 8. It says, what signs of erosion are present? You know, it's leaf push, which I had no idea what that was. But rill erosion, gully erosion, well, we know we have intermittent streams. Are they gullies? Well, they're intermittent streams. So I spend a lot of time out in the woods, I guess, and it's like, okay, to me, it's not a gully, it's an intermittent stream. So I don't know if
I
that's an NA question or an NA checkbox or.
Yeah, I'd look at the application, that specific guidance that goes
Yep.
along with that and how they
Okay.
define each of those terms, to
Okay.
be able to share it. Because when you think about like gullying, so I'll say, like, I came to Vermont from North Carolina, and they call them the gully washer thunderstorms, right? Like that's the piece where like you can see it go down, and all of a sudden there's like this 6-inch trench in the
Right.
middle of the trail. Like that's what they're talking about when they're talking about like gullying level of erosion, is that type of impact that you can see where it's just like the rainwater coming down the hill. So I make sure you check that application, that guidance is related to that, and just see how that definition fits best to it. But if like the only side is the spot where it crosses, the intermittent stream section should have that. So this is generally looking for like places beyond that, or like even just where it crosses the trail.
Okay, great. Hey, thanks very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. All right, I think I see another hand to Sophie.
I think Shelley's hand was up before mine. I don't know if she still has a question.
I think I was just answering
Nope.
Shelley's questions.
Yes,
Oh,
I'm all
okay,
set.
sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Hi. So we've emailed this question, but we didn't get a clear answer, so I'm going to ask it again. We have a project identified in a comprehensive plan, but we have not gone to full design yet. It does replace some structures that are currently there because they've aged out, but another one will be moved, and in addition, we'll be adding some stormwater features. Is it like, would it be worth doing a RFP at this time for the design to show that we're moving towards it and we have no qualms about meeting the timeline for the LWCF? Or yeah, I guess we just want to make sure that our project is suitable.
Yeah, thank you for asking that again in this different way. So I appreciate that, because I think I interpret it differently via email. And so with this, like in terms of showing your readiness for LWCF, like that's what it's about. Like if you have generally, so I'll back up. LWCF for development projects funds shovel-ready projects at that point. They need to be shovel-ready by the time that National Park Service approval comes through. Like that's the
Okay.
requirement. But it's not me you need to convince that it will be shovel-ready by then. It is our ranking and review committee. And so the way with the review works is at the pre-application stage, it is our staff that will be reviewing it. Again, we're just doing bare bones checking for eligibility, readiness, like, and our readiness is like, did you fill out the forms? Do you have enough information to fill out the forms? And just to like give a quick example of how what doesn't look like that, we've had people go through the permit navigator tool, and if you click unknown on every single one of those bubbles, it will spit you out a list of about 37 permits you may or may not need for that work. And that's a pretty big flag to us that you just don't have enough information yet to move forward at this point. So like we're looking for like big picture readiness. You left half of the climate resilience form blank, that you're just not ready for that. So that's what we're looking for, the pre-application phase. And it's a staff skim looking for eligible projects, right? If we get a submission from a nonprofit, they're ineligible for LWCF. If you want to do your indoor community center, it's ineligible for LWCF. That's what we're skimming for at this point.
Okay.
At the full application phase, we will have a recruited external review committee that has a variety of expertise. Generally, we have every proposal scored independently by at least 3 different reviewers quantitatively. And then we get together to talk about the qualitative pieces that go beyond just the numbers, things like geographic spread, and other pieces like that. And all of those will be spelled out in the full application guidance of what we're looking for. And so I share this to say that when you're talking about your readiness, do you need a plan at this point? No, but you need to have a pretty firm idea of like what you're going to do, and that your proposal will then need to communicate to the ranking committee to convince them that it will be shovel ready by that point. So I know that's a bit of a It depends answer, but that's really what it is, right? Like it really comes
Yeah.
down to that middle section. And so if you have, for this particular project, like, where the things are going to be, generally what you're going to do. Like that's for us, like, I think it's probably good enough to start putting together that proposal. But in terms of like, will your stormwater pond be, 20 by 30 or 15 by 35? That is a final design piece that can come later. Like that is not that kind of final component. Like things sometimes change. Again, that grantee that I was talking to today, it's a different program, but like they've been working with the wetlands permitting people, and like then they're like, oh, actually we're gonna change the route of our trail. Like we're still doing a trail from A to B, but instead of going here, it's gonna go here so we can go around the wetland. Like those things all happen, and that's continuously fine. And like generally a final design would include that. So you don't need to be there yet, but you'll need to eventually convince the ranking committee that you'll be ready.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Marlena, do we have any other questions in the chat?
Not seeing anything else at this time. Oh, just kidding. Jill has a question. Had a question. I had to jump off, so I'm sorry if this was already covered. The land for our project is owned by the school district and leased by the municipality for recreation purposes. We have approval from the school district to build. On the pre-app, what should we select for control and tenure? Partial ownership? Question mark.
Yeah, so if you have, let's follow up with that via email, because it depends who's the applicant and who's the owner. Because generally with LWCF, they want to see those publicly owned lands generally be submitted by the group that, like, if it's a publicly owned land, say it's a school district owned land, the school district can actually apply for LWCF if it is a public entity. Like if it's a private school, unfortunately that's not going to work, because privately owned land, LWCF cannot fund privately owned land. But there are some pieces. I think there's that one for like if you have an easement with that long-term lease agreement with federal lands, that might fit that school district piece. So Jill, if you wouldn't mind following up with us, because that's a really unique circumstance, and tell us a little bit more information about that ownership relationship, we'll be happy to direct you to the right answer for your form. So thank you for asking that. Fabulous. Well, I'm not seeing many other questions come up or raised hands. If you do have additional questions that do come up, please feel free to reach out to us by email. We're happy to do that, happy to respond. And otherwise, we wish you all the best as you are moving forward with this project planning. And we'll look forward to seeing hopefully many of you on a future office hours. So thanks so much and have a great day.